She told no one about the abortion, but the vampire king heard the heartbeat fade through the clinic wall. He waited outside her room, silent as stone. What she didn't know, the child carried his bloodline from a single forgotten night, and vampire law demanded he claim both mother and lost heir. Now she owes him a debt written in ancient blood. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like mechanical insects, their cold glow washing the corridor in shades of pale green and sick yellow. Mara Chen's legs trembled as she pushed through the recovery room door at 11:47, the paper gown rustling against her thighs with every unsteady step. The antiseptic smell clung to her nostrils, sharp and chemical, mixing with the faint medicinal tang that seemed baked into the clinic walls. Beyond the narrow windows at the corridor's end, rain tapped against glass in irregular rhythms, Seattle's perpetual drizzle turning the night outside into a blur of streetlights and wet pavement. Her hand found the wall for balance. The cramps had subsided to a dull ache, but her body felt hollowed out, emptied of something she had barely begun to acknowledge existed. 3 hours ago she had signed the forms. 2 hours ago the procedure had ended. Now she just wanted to go home, crawl into bed, and pretend this day had never happened. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now let's continue. She had told no one. Not her mother in Tacoma, not her roommate who thought she was working a late shift at the crisis center, not the grad school advisor who kept asking if everything was okay. Some decisions you made alone, carried alone, survived alone. That was how Mara had learned to navigate the world after her father left when she was 12, after she put herself through community college waiting tables, after she clawed her way into a social work master's program on loans and willpower. You handled your own problems. You didn't burden others. You certainly didn't make mistakes like getting pregnant from a one-night stand with a man whose last name you never learned. The corridor stretched longer than she remembered. Her sneakers squeaked against linoleum as she passed darkened exam rooms, a nurse's station with a single lamp burning, a vending machine humming to itself in the corner. The clinic kept late hours for women like her, women who needed privacy, who couldn't afford to be seen entering a place like this during daylight. She appreciated that discretion now. Her purse hung heavy on her shoulder. Inside, her phone sat dead, the battery drained hours ago. She would charge it when she got home. She would sleep. Tomorrow she would wake up, and everything would go back to normal. The brief flare of possibility extinguished before it could derail the careful plans she had made for her life. She was 28. She had 2 more years of school. She worked 20 hours a week at a women's shelter and volunteered at a youth crisis line. There was no room for a child, no money, no partner, no foundation upon which to build that kind of future. The choice had been obvious, even if it hollowed her out to make it. She turned the corner toward the exit and stopped. A man stood in the corridor between her and the door. Tall, over 6 feet, with the kind of stillness that made her think of statues in museums. He wore a charcoal suit, tailored so precisely it looked like it had been painted onto his frame, the fabric catching the fluorescent light in subtle gradations of gray. His skin was pale, not the pallor of someone who avoided the sun, but something deeper, bloodless, as if all warmth had been leached from his flesh decades ago. His hair was dark and swept back from a face that might have been handsome if it weren't so remote, so utterly devoid of anything she recognized as human expression. And his eyes. Even from 10 feet away, she could see them, gray like winter fog, like steel, like something ancient and patient, and entirely without mercy. He was looking at her, not glancing, not noticing in passing, but looking with the focused intensity of someone who had been waiting specifically for her to appear. Mara's first thought was that he was one of those protesters, the ones who sometimes stationed themselves outside clinics with signs and prayers and judgment wrapped in concern. But the clinic's security was good. They didn't let protesters inside. And this man didn't look like he cared about her soul. He looked like he cared about something far more specific and infinitely stranger. She tried to move past him, angling toward the wall to give him a wide berth. He spoke before she took 3 steps. His voice was formal, each word enunciated with the precision of someone for whom English was a learned language, though his accent was so faint and so old she couldn't place its origin. It might have been British. It might have been something else entirely, something from a time when the borders of nations were drawn differently and the language itself sounded foreign to modern ears. He said her full name, Mara Chen. Not Miss Chen, not ma'am, but her complete legal name spoken with utter certainty. She froze. She had never seen this man before in her life. She was sure of it. He wasn't someone you forgot. The debt requires acknowledgement, he said, and his tone suggested he was quoting something, reciting a phrase worn smooth by centuries of repetition. Her heart kicked against her ribs. She thought about screaming, about running back toward the nurse's station, but her legs still felt unsteady, and something about his absolute stillness made her think running would trigger something worse than standing here confused and frightened. Instead, she tried to push past him, one hand coming up to shove against his chest. It was like pushing a stone wall. Her palm connected with the expensive fabric of his suit, and beneath it there was no give, no warmth, no yielding flesh. Just cold hardness, unyielding as bedrock. His hand caught her wrist before she could pull away. His fingers were long and his grip was gentle, but completely immovable. And the cold of his skin seeped through her pulse point like ice water injected directly into her veins. Not the cold of someone with poor circulation. Not even the cold of a corpse fresh from the morgue. Something older. Something that had never known warmth. She jerked back instinctively, but he held her without effort, his expression unchanged. "By the Bloodright Accord of 1847, he said. And now his voice had taken on a different quality, something ritual and inflexible. A vampire's progeny cannot be terminated without the sire's consent. You carried my bloodline. The law demands recompense. The words didn't make sense. She stared at him, her breath coming faster, her mind struggling to parse what he was saying into anything resembling reality. Progeny, bloodline, vampire. The last word should have made her laugh, except nothing about this man suggested humor or delusion. He believed what he was saying. Worse, he expected her to believe it too. "You need to let me go," she managed, her voice thin and higher than usual. "I don't know what you think happened, but you have the wrong person. I just want to go home." He released her wrist, but didn't step aside. For a moment she thought about bolting past him, forcing her way to the door through sheer momentum. Then she made the mistake of glancing at the glass door 10 feet behind him. The fluorescent lights reflected off its surface, throwing back her own pale face, the empty corridor, the vending machine's dull glow. But where the man stood, there was nothing. No reflection, no charcoal suit, no tall figure blocking her path. Just empty air, where he should have been. Her breath stopped. She looked back at him, at his solid 3-dimensional presence, then at the glass again. Nothing. Her mind tried to supply explanations. Angle of the light, weird properties of the glass, exhaustion and medication making her see things that weren't there. But she knew what she was seeing and what it meant, even if every rational part of her brain was screaming that it was impossible. 3 weeks ago, she had gone to a corporate gala at the Fairmont Olympic Hotel, one of those networking events her program advisor had insisted would be good for her career. She had worn a borrowed dress and drunk too much champagne on an empty stomach, trying to make conversation with nonprofit directors and city officials who might one day hire her. She remembered a man with gray eyes and an accent she couldn't place. Someone who talked to her like she was interesting rather than useful, who made her laugh, who bought her another glass of champagne when she should have switched to water. She remembered feeling warm and reckless and seen in a way she hadn't felt in years. She remembered going back to his hotel room. After that, things got foggy. She woke up alone in her own apartment at dawn, still in the borrowed dress, with bruises on her inner arms that looked like thumbprints and a headache that felt like someone had driven a spike through her temple. She had assumed she blacked out, got herself home somehow, passed out in her own bed. The bruises faded, the headache went away. 3 weeks later, she missed her period. The father was just some one-night stand, she stammered now, looking at the man who cast no reflection. Nobody special. And it's done now. I don't owe anyone anything. The man's expression shifted fractionally, something that might have been grief passing across his features like wind across still water. The father was Lucien Thorne, he said quietly. My son. He died 4 nights ago. His jaw tightened, the only sign of emotion he permitted himself. You carried the last of my line. He reached into his jacket and withdrew a photograph, extending it toward her. She took it with numb fingers. The image showed a young man, maybe 30, with the same gray eyes as the stranger from the gala, the same angular bone structure. He was lying in what looked like an ornate bedroom, his shirt torn open, a wooden stake driven through his chest, his eyes open and empty. Blood, dark and wrong-looking, pooled beneath him. Dead. Violently, ritually murdered. She felt the corridor tilt. This was the man from the gala. She was suddenly certain of it, even though her memories of that night were fragmentary at best. Those eyes, that face. She had seen it on a hotel pillow, had felt those hands on her skin, had heard that voice murmur something in a language she didn't understand. And now he was dead. And this man, this thing standing in front of her, claimed to be his father, claimed she had been pregnant with his grandchild, claimed there was a law, an accord, a debt. Vampire law, he continued, his voice taking on the cadence of someone reciting legal text, states that if a human unknowingly destroys vampire progeny, they owe the sire a life debt. Service until the bloodline is restored or the debt is paid in another coin. His gray eyes fixed on her with uncomfortable intensity. You did not know what you carried. That absolves you of malice, but not of consequence. The debt stands. This couldn't be happening. She wanted to laugh, to shove past him and run into the rain and wake up from whatever fever dream the medication had triggered. But his hand on her wrist had been real. The absence of his reflection had been real. And looking at him now, at the way he held himself with the patience of something that had outlived empires, she knew with cold certainty that he was telling her the truth as he understood it. Even if that truth was impossible. What do you want from me? She whispered. You will come with me tonight to my estate, he said. There will be a formal acknowledgement before the Vampire Council. The debt will be witnessed and recorded. After that, we will discuss terms. She shook her head, stepping back. I'm not going anywhere with you. I don't care what you think I owe you. I'm going home. The alternative, he said, and his voice went colder still, is that I leave you here. By dawn, every coven on the West Coast will know you as an oath-breaker who destroyed vampire progeny and refused acknowledgement. They will hunt you. Some will kill you quickly. Others will take their time. He tilted his head fractionally. I am offering you the option of law and order, Miss Chen. Refuse it, and you enter a world that operates by much older rules. She wanted to call his bluff, but something in his eyes told her this was no bluff. This was a man, a creature, who had lived long enough to see threats through to their conclusion. If she ran, she would be running for the rest of her life, if she had a life left at all. Her hand went to her stomach, still tender from the procedure. There was nothing there now, just empty space where something had been growing, something she hadn't wanted, something she'd had every right to choose not to continue. Except apparently it hadn't been just hers to choose. Apparently, there were laws she'd never heard of, debts incurred in ignorance, consequences that reached beyond the boundaries of the human world she thought she understood. She felt fury rising through the fear. This wasn't fair. None of this was fair. But fairness, she was learning, was a concept that didn't extend beyond the narrow borders of human law. She looked at the photograph again, at Lucien Thorne's dead eyes, and felt something twist in her chest that might have been grief or might have been the last shred of her normal life tearing away. "Fine," she said. "I'll go. But this doesn't mean I accept whatever debt you think exists." The man who called himself Lucien Thorne inclined his head fractionally. "Your acceptance is not required. Only your presence." He gestured toward the exit. "After you, Miss Chen." She walked past him on shaking legs, pushed through the glass door into the rain. Outside, a vintage Rolls-Royce idled at the curb, its black paint gleaming wet. 3 figures in dark clothing stood beside it, utterly still, rain falling on them without seeming to touch them. They turned as one when she emerged, their faces pale blurs in the darkness. Lucien's hand came to rest on the small of her back, a touch that was somehow both courteous and completely controlling. "They're already watching you, Miss Chen," he said quietly. "Your choice was made the moment you walked into that clinic." The car door opened. She got in because there was nowhere else to go. The interior smelled of old leather and something faintly metallic. One of the figures slid into the driver's seat without a word. Lucien settled beside her, his presence filling the space like cold water. The door closed with a heavy, final sound. They pulled away from the clinic, rain streaking the windows, the city lights blurring into abstract shapes. Mara's phone stayed dead in her purse. Her apartment receded with every block. The life she'd known, the careful plans she'd made, the future she'd been building all fell away behind her like a dream dissolving at dawn. She was entering a different world now, one with different rules, different debts, different prices. And sitting beside her, patient as stone, was the king who would collect what he believed she owed. The Rolls-Royce glided through rain-slicked streets toward the highlands, moving with the kind of smooth inevitability that suggested this journey had been predetermined from the moment she'd made her appointment at the clinic. Mara sat in numb silence, her hands folded in her lap, her mind refusing to process what was happening in favor of cataloging small details. The way the leather seats didn't squeak. The absence of engine noise despite the fact that they were clearly moving. The way Lucien sat perfectly still beside her, not breathing, not shifting, just existing in a state of absolute motionless presence. She reached for her phone, some automatic impulse to text someone, to leave some record of where she was going. The screen stayed black. She pressed the power button. Nothing. It had been at 30% battery when she'd turned it off before the procedure. Now it was completely dead, as if something had drained it to empty. Vampire tech suppression, she would learn later. For now, it was just another small wrongness in a night full of impossible things. The car climbed into the hills, leaving behind the commercial streets of Capitol Hill for residential neighborhoods where houses sat behind gates and tall hedges. The rain intensified, drumming on the roof, turning the world outside into a watercolor smear. After 20 minutes, they turned through iron gates that opened soundlessly, gliding up a curved driveway to a mansion that looked like it had been transplanted from another era entirely. The house was massive, a restored 1920s estate built in the Tudor Revival style, all dark timber and leaded glass windows. Warm light glowed from inside, but it had a strange quality, flickering and golden in a way that didn't match modern electric lighting. As they pulled to a stop before the entrance, Mara realized why. Through the windows she could see candelabras and what looked like actual gas lights, flame-driven illumination in a house that certainly had to have electricity. Aesthetic choice, she thought. Or maybe nostalgia for vampires old enough to remember when gaslight was cutting-edge technology. The driver opened her door. She stepped out into the rain, which soaked through her jacket immediately. Lucien appeared beside her, completely dry despite the downpour, as if the water was simply declining to touch him. He guided her up stone steps to an entrance flanked by iron lanterns. The door opened before they reached it. Inside, the house was exactly as strange as she'd feared. The entry hall stretched vast and shadowy, lit by a chandelier that held actual candles, their flames steady despite the air that should have made them flicker. A grand staircase curved upward into darkness. Doorways led off in multiple directions, revealing glimpses of rooms furnished in period pieces that looked original rather than reproduction. And standing in those doorways, watching her enter, were more of them. She counted 5 before she stopped counting. Men and women in clothing that ranged from modern to vaguely historical, all sharing that same quality of absolute stillness. They didn't breathe between sentences. They didn't shift their weight or blink unnecessarily or make any of the tiny unconscious movements that marked something as alive. They simply stood and watched, their eyes reflecting the candlelight like animals caught in headlights. Staff moved between them, human staff in what looked like period dress, long skirts and high collars, and expressions of careful neutrality. They didn't meet Mara's eyes as they took coats and moved silently through the halls. One of the vampires stepped forward, a woman who might have been 40 or 400, her sharp features framed by dark hair swept into an elegant twist. She wore emerald silk that moved like water, and when she looked at Mara, her expression was one of cold politeness stretched over something that might have been contempt. "Isolde," Lucien said by way of introduction. "My lieutenant." The woman inclined her head fractionally. "Miss Chen, welcome to House Thorne." Her tone suggested welcome was the last thing Mara should feel. Another vampire appeared. This one male, broad-shouldered and scarred, his face looking like it had been broken and healed at least twice. He wore modern tactical clothing, all blacks and grays, and he watched Mara the way a soldier watches a potential threat. "Marcus," Lucien said, "head of security." Marcus nodded once, but didn't speak. His eyes never left Mara, cataloging her movements, her posture, her potential as either asset or danger. The last figure to emerge was different. An elderly woman, white-haired and kind-eyed, wearing a simple gray dress that might have been from any era in the last 2 centuries. She moved with the careful grace of the very old, though Mara was learning that appearances meant nothing here. When the woman smiled, there was genuine warmth in it, the first thing in this house that felt remotely human. "Elena," Lucien said, and his tone shifted to something closer to respect. "Keeper of oaths, she will conduct the acknowledgement." Elena approached and took both of Mara's hands in hers. Her skin was as cold as Lucien's, but her grip was gentle. "Welcome, child," she said, and her voice had an accent that might have been Italian or Spanish or something older than both. "I know you are frightened. That is natural. But I promise you, the ritual will not harm you. It merely makes formal what already exists." Mara wanted to ask what exactly already existed, wanted to demand answers and explanations and proof that any of this was real. But Elena was already turning, gesturing toward a corridor that led deeper into the house. "This way, please." They walked through halls lined with portraits of stern-faced men and women in historical dress, through rooms filled with furniture that belonged in museums, past windows that showed only darkness and rain. Eventually, they descended a narrow staircase into what must have been the mansion's lower level. The temperature dropped 10 degrees. The air smelled of stone and age. They entered a circular chamber carved entirely from marble, its walls inscribed with symbols Mara didn't recognize, curving scripts and geometric patterns that hurt to look at too long. A silver basin sat on a pedestal in the center. Ancient texts rested on smaller pedestals around the perimeter, their pages yellow and fragile. Candles burned in wall sconces, providing the only light. Elena moved to the basin and began speaking in a language that sounded like Latin, but wasn't, explaining the ritual in English between phrases of the older tongue. Lucien Thorne, she said, was Lucien's only child in 400 years. Vampires reproduce rarely. The transmission of bloodline requires specific conditions, a conjunction of will and biology, and something else she called essence that Mara didn't understand. When it happens, the resulting child carries the sire's full power, their genetic legacy, their claim to immortality. Dorian had been that rare thing, a vampire's true heir. And 4 nights ago he had been murdered in what Elena described carefully as a coven war that Lucien thought he had ended decades ago. The ritual would bind Mara to House Thorne, would mark her as debt-bearer, would ensure she could not flee or reveal what she knew without consequences. It was law, Elena explained. Ancient law, older than nations, enforced not by courts but by collective agreement among the vampire houses that this was how such debts were handled. Without the law, there would be chaos. Without the ritual, Mara would be hunted. Elena produced a small silver knife and held out her hand. Mara's hand, she specified. Mara extended her left hand, watched the blade slice across her palm. The pain was sharp and immediate. Blood welled, dripping into the basin where Elena had already placed ash from what she called Dorian's pyre. The blood hit the ash and sizzled, steam rising, the mixture turning colors that blood shouldn't turn. Elena spoke words in the old language, her voice rising and falling in rhythmic cadence. The candles flared brighter. And then Mara's wrist burned with cold fire, a sensation like ice pressed directly against bone. She cried out, tried to pull away, but Elena held her steady. The burning intensified, peaked, then faded to a dull ache. When Mara looked down, a crimson mark glowed on her left wrist, a symbol that matched some of the carvings on the walls. Even as she watched, it faded to a thin, scar-like line, red against her skin, permanent. Elena released her hand. "It is done," she said softly. "You are bound to Lucien's house. You cannot leave the city without his permission. You cannot reveal vampire existence without forfeiting your life. The debt must be settled within 1 lunar year." Mara stared at the mark, at the proof that this was all real and binding and inescapable. She wanted to cry, but her eyes stayed dry. She wanted to scream, but her throat closed. Instead, she just stood there, marked and claimed, no longer entirely her own. Lucien stepped forward and gestured toward the exit. "We should speak privately," he said. After the ritual, he took her to his study, a room lined floor to ceiling with books in multiple languages, a fire burning in the hearth that gave off light but no heat, more vampire aesthetic. He gestured to a leather chair, and she sat because her legs were shaking again. He remained standing, looking older somehow, tired in a way that should have been impossible for someone who didn't age. He asked about the pregnancy. "Did you know?" he said. "Why did you choose termination?" She told him the truth because lies seemed pointless now. She hadn't known it wasn't human. She was a graduate student in social work, barely making rent in a shared apartment. She worked 2 part-time jobs and volunteered at a crisis center. There was no room for a child, no money, no partner, no foundation. She thought she was alone. She thought she was making the only choice that made sense given her circumstances. Lucien listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You were never alone. Dorian was watching you. He wrote to me about you. Said he'd found someone who saw people, truly saw them. He planned to tell you what he was." He paused, something like pain crossing his features. Then his enemies found him first. Mara felt something crack inside her chest. She thought of the bruises on her arms, the foggy memories, the sense that something important had happened that night that she couldn't quite grasp. Dorian had been real. He had wanted to tell her, and now he was dead, and she would never know what might have been. Lucien moved to the window, looking out at rain and darkness. "I do not blame you for the abortion," he said quietly. "You acted in ignorance and under difficult circumstances. The debt is not about punishment, Miss Chen. It is about ancient law that I must uphold or lose all authority over my coven. If I cannot enforce the Bloodright Accord, I cannot lead. And if I cannot lead, the fragile peace I have built between vampires and humans will collapse." He turned back to face her. "You will live here in the estate. You will assist Elena in researching Dorian's murderers. Your skills in reading people, in noticing patterns, in understanding human behavior are valuable in ways you cannot yet appreciate. If you help us find the killers, the debt is paid. Your life returns to normal." She wanted to argue, but exhaustion was settling over her like a heavy blanket. She nodded once, a jerky movement that wasn't quite agreement, but wasn't refusal either. A young vampire appeared to show her to her room. They climbed stairs to the second floor, walked down a corridor lined with closed doors, stopped at a suite that was larger than her entire apartment. The bedroom held a four-poster bed with silk sheets, an adjoining bathroom with a clawfoot tub, a sitting area with overstuffed chairs and more books. A nightgown had been laid out on the bed. Fresh towels hung in the bathroom. Someone had anticipated her arrival down to the smallest detail. The young vampire who introduced herself as Sarah explained that human food would be brought to her room in the morning, that she was free to move through the house and grounds, but should not attempt to leave the property without permission. Then Sarah left, closing the door softly. Mara stood alone in the too large room and finally let herself feel the weight of everything that had happened. She moved to the window, pulled back heavy curtains, and looked out at the grounds. Rain fell on manicured gardens, on stone paths, on the iron fence that marked the property's edge. And there, at the tree line beyond the fence, a figure stood watching the house. Too far to make out details, but close enough to be clearly visible, clearly deliberate. Marcus appeared at her shoulder so silently she jumped. She hadn't heard him enter. He looked where she was looking, his expression hardening. "The Corvus Coven knows you're here," he said quietly. "They're the ones who killed Dorian." His voice dropped lower. "And they know you carried his child." Mara woke in silk sheets so soft they felt like water against her skin, the kind of luxury she had only encountered in hotel lobbies she couldn't afford to stay in. For 3 perfect seconds she didn't remember where she was, her mind supplying the comforting fiction that she was in her own narrow bed in the apartment she shared with 2 other grad students, that the alarm would go off any moment and she would stumble to class with coffee burning her tongue and assignments she'd finished at 2 in the morning. Then she opened her eyes and saw the canopy above her, dark wood carved with symbols she didn't recognize, and everything came crashing back. The clinic, the man with no reflection, the ritual that had burned a mark into her wrist. She was in a vampire's house, bound by laws she didn't understand, marked as property or debt or whatever the Bloodright Accord made her. She sat up slowly, her body still tender from the procedure, and took stock of her surroundings in daylight. Except there was no daylight. Heavy blackout curtains covered what she assumed were windows, blocking out every trace of sun. A single lamp burned on the bedside table, its light warm and golden, and entirely insufficient for the size of the room. She found her phone on the nightstand where she'd left it. Still dead. She held down the power button for a full minute. Nothing. Whatever had drained it yesterday hadn't reversed itself overnight. Outside her door she found a breakfast tray, white porcelain and silver covers keeping the food warm. Croissants that flaked at the touch, butter in a small crystal dish, orange juice in a cut glass tumbler, coffee in a carafe that still steamed. human food prepared by human hands she hadn't seen. The staff in period dress moved through this house like ghosts, present but invisible, serving masters who didn't eat. She brought the tray inside and ate standing at the window, pulling back one corner of the blackout curtain to look at the grounds. Morning light, gray and filtered through rain clouds, revealed manicured gardens and stone paths and the iron fence she'd seen last night. Beyond it, dense trees pressed close, and somewhere in those trees, the Corvus coven was watching, waiting. She tested the bedroom door. Unlocked. The hallway beyond was empty, lit by the same kind of warm lamplight that seemed to be the house's primary illumination. She walked slowly, trailing her hand along wallpaper that felt expensive under her fingers, past closed doors and portraits of stern-faced people who might have been Lucien's ancestors, or might have been vampires he'd known centuries ago. She found a staircase and descended to the main floor, looking for an exit, for her car, for any way back to the life she'd been living 48 hours ago. The front door was massive oak reinforced with iron. She tried the handle. Locked. Not with a deadbolt she could turn, but with some mechanism she couldn't see or access from the inside. She was about to search for another exit when Marcus materialized behind her with the unnerving silence all the vampires seemed to possess. "You're free to move within the grounds," he said, his voice flat and professional. "Beyond the gate requires the Vampire King's permission." She turned to face him, this scarred soldier who watched her like she might pull a weapon at any moment. "What if I just leave anyway?" she said. "Walk out the gate. Catch a bus back to my actual life." He didn't smile. "You're welcome to try. The mark on your wrist will burn hotter the farther you get from the estate. By the time you reach the gate, it will feel like your arm is on fire. By the time you reach the street, it will actually be on fire." He paused. "And that's assuming the Corvus vampires watching the perimeter don't take you first." She looked down at the thin red line on her wrist. "So, I'm a prisoner." He considered this. "You're protected. There's a difference." She wanted to argue, but he was already walking away, leaving her standing in the foyer with nowhere to go. She spent the next hour exploring the parts of the house that weren't locked, finding a music room with a grand piano, a dining room with a table that could seat 20, a conservatory filled with plants that shouldn't have been able to grow without sunlight, but somehow thrived under lamps that mimicked the sun's spectrum. Eventually she found the library, 2 stories of books in languages she recognized and many she didn't, rolling ladders and leather chairs and the smell of old paper. Case files were spread across a long table near the windows. She recognized Elena's handwriting on some of the notes, careful script in fading ink. She sat down and started reading. The Corvus Coven. A rival house led by Constantine Corvus, turned in the 1700s during some European conflict the notes didn't specify. He believed Lucien's peace treaties with humans made vampires weak, that their kind should rule openly rather than hide in the shadows. For decades, he'd been agitating for war, for a return to what he called the old ways, when vampires took what they wanted and humans knew their place as prey. Lucien had resisted, had built alliances with other houses, had created the framework for coexistence that apparently governed the modern vampire world. And Dorian's murder was designed to shatter that framework, to provoke Lucien into retaliation that would justify Corvus's position that peace was impossible. She was so absorbed in the files she didn't hear Lucien enter until he spoke from directly behind her. "You're a quick study," he said. His voice was different than it had been last night, slower, less focused. She turned and saw him leaning against one of the bookcases, his usual immaculate appearance slightly disheveled, his eyes less sharp. Daylight hours, she realized. Vampires were strongest at night. During the day they were awake but diminished, like humans running on too little sleep. He moved to the table and sat across from her, gesturing at the files. "What have you learned?" "That your son was killed to start a war," she said. That if you retaliate, the fragile truce between vampire houses collapses. That if you don't, you look weak, and Corvus will challenge your kingship. She met his eyes. And that I'm not just paying a debt, I'm bait. He didn't deny it. Corvus will come for you to draw me out. The question is whether I can protect you long enough to find evidence that will discredit him before the council. The council, she repeated. Elena mentioned them last night. Who are they? The 7 ruling houses, he said. Thorne, Corvus, Drayton, Silvano, Ashford, Kurakawa, Volkov. We maintain the masquerade, enforce the laws, settle disputes. Without the council, there would be chaos, every coven fighting for territory and resources. With it, we have order. Imperfect, but functional. He leaned back in his chair. Corvus wants to destroy that order. He believes vampires should not be bound by human morality or human law. She thought about this, about the implications of a world where creatures this strong and this patient decided they didn't need to hide anymore. How many vampires are there? She asked. Enough, he said. Not as many as humans fear, more than humans know. We are rare because we reproduce rarely, and because we are very good at killing each other. A pause. Dorian was my only child in 400 years. The grief in his voice was quiet, but unmistakable. She looked down at the files, at the photographs of crime scenes and ritual killings, and evidence of a hidden world at war with itself. Then she saw it, half hidden under a stack of Elena's notes. A leather-bound journal, its cover worn smooth with handling. She pulled it free and opened it at random. Sketches filled the pages, detailed drawings in pencil and ink, buildings, faces, street scenes, and then, halfway through, her own face looking back at her from the page. She was sitting in what she recognized as the coffee shop 3 blocks from campus, where she studied between classes. The drawing captured her hunched over a textbook, coffee cup at her elbow, hair falling forward to hide her face. The detail was extraordinary. The artist had noticed everything, the way she chewed her pen when she was thinking, the specific tilt of her head, the exhaustion in the set of her shoulders. She turned the page. Another sketch, this time in the bookstore near Pike Place Market where she browsed on Sunday afternoons when she should have been writing papers. Another page, the Youth Crisis Center where she volunteered, her face visible through the window as she talked on the phone to some teenager in trouble. Page after page of her life, observed and recorded by someone who had been watching for months. That's Dorian's journal, Lucien said quietly. He was trying to find the courage to approach you properly, to tell you what he was before things went further. She felt something twist in her chest, a complicated tangle of violation and tenderness. He'd been stalking her, yes, but the drawings didn't feel predatory. They felt careful, almost reverent, the work of someone trying to understand rather than possess. She found an entry dated 2 days before his death, the handwriting rushed and excited. Told father about M today, it read. He warned me humans break easily. But she's already broken in the ways that matter, and still she helps others piece themselves together. I think she could love a monster if the monster was honest. Tomorrow, I'll tell her the truth. Tomorrow, I'll give her the choice. Mara closed the journal carefully, her hands shaking. She might have loved him back. This stranger with gray eyes who drew her in coffee shops and planned to be honest about what he was. Now she would never know what that choice might have looked like, what future they might have built if he'd lived long enough to offer it. I'm sorry, Lucien said, for your loss as well as mine. Before she could respond, Marcus appeared in the doorway with the kind of urgency that suggested something had gone very wrong. Package at the gate, he said. Hand delivered. You need to see this. They convened in what Lucien called the war room, a windowless chamber in the center of the house with a long table and screens showing security feeds from cameras positioned around the property. The package sat on the table, already opened, and Mara felt her stomach drop when she saw what was inside. A silver dagger, its blade still stained with something dark and wrong-looking, and a note written in ink that might have been blood. "The bloodline ended with your son," it read in elegant script. "The human carries nothing now but borrowed time. Return her and we'll call the debt settled." Lucien stood perfectly still, staring at the dagger with an expression that might have been carved from ice. "That's the blade that killed Dorian," Elena said softly. She had appeared with the others, Isolde and a thin vampire in a tailored suit who Lucien introduced as Thomas, and young Sarah, whose eyes were wide with fear. "A council meeting, then," Lucien said. "What are our options?" Isolde spoke first, her voice clipped and practical. "Give the human to Corvus. She's a liability, a mortal who knows too much. Her life isn't worth risking war." Elena's response was immediate. "The Bloodright Accord is sacred. Breaking it destroys your legitimacy as king. If you cannot enforce the law, you cannot lead." Thomas adjusted his glasses, a oddly human gesture. "Corvus is testing you. If you give her up, you look weak. If you keep her and he attacks you, look like you're choosing a human over peace. Either way, he wins." Sarah said nothing, but her eyes kept darting to Mara with something that might have been sympathy. Lucien was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "Mara stays. I will not negotiate with those who murdered my son." Mara had been listening to them debate her fate like she was an object rather than a person, and something inside her snapped. She stood up, her chair scraping loud against the floor. "Does my opinion matter at all?" she said. Everyone turned to look at her. "I'm the one at risk. I'm the one Corvus wants. Don't I get a say in whether you hand me over or start a war?" Lucian's expression shifted, something almost vulnerable crossing his features. "What would you choose, Miss Chen?" he asked quietly. She thought about Dorian's journal, about the drawings and the words and the future that had been stolen from both of them. "I want to help find his killers," she said. "Not because of the debt, because reading his journal made him real, because someone should care that he's gone." She met Lucien's eyes. "And if that makes me bait, then fine, but I'm not going to sit in a locked room while you decide my fate." Lucien nodded slowly, something like respect in his gaze. "Then we prepare for war," he said. That night the attack came. Mara was in her room reading more of Dorian's journal when alarms shrieked through the house, high-pitched and urgent. Marcus appeared in her doorway within seconds, grabbing her arm and pulling her into the hallway. "Safe room," he said. "Now." They ran through corridors as the Peikesa house erupted into controlled chaos. Vampires moving with inhuman speed toward defensive positions, human staff vanishing into hidden spaces. Marcus pulled her down a narrow staircase to a reinforced door, punched a code into a keypad, shoved her inside. "Surveillance feeds," he said, gesturing at screens mounted on the wall. "Watch and learn." Then he was gone, the door sealing behind him with a heavy metallic sound. Mara turned to the screens and watched the attack unfold. 3 vampires had breached the perimeter, moving faster than the cameras could properly track. Blurs of motion across the manicured grounds. They hit the house's outer defenses, and Lucien's people met them with coordinated precision. But it was Lucien himself who held her attention. She watched him fight and understood for the first time what he truly was. He moved faster than her eyes could follow, a dark shape that seemed to be in 3 places at once. When he struck, vampires fell, and when one tried to grapple with him, he simply tore the attacker's head from his shoulders with a wet sound she could hear even through the surveillance audio. It was terrifying. It was efficient. It was utterly without mercy. The attackers retreated within minutes, scattering back into the woods, but they left one behind, A wounded vampire, silver burns on his arms where Marcus had caught him, being dragged into the house by two of Lucien's people. Mara watched them take him to the cellar, to a room she hadn't known existed, and chain him to a chair with silver manacles. Then Lucien entered the frame and the interrogation began. She couldn't hear everything through the feed, but she heard enough. The prisoner's name was Nikolai. He spat defiance, even chained and burned, telling Lucien that Constantine knew about the human, knew she was pregnant, knew the Bloodright Accord didn't apply because she terminated the line willingly, that Lucien had no legitimate claim. The screen went dark as someone covered the camera. Mara sat in the safe room trying not to imagine what was happening in that cellar. An hour later, Marcus came to retrieve her. The house was quiet again, damage minimal, no casualties on their side. But in the war room, Thomas was surrounded by ancient texts and modern laptops, researching through the night. He looked up when Mara entered, his expression grim. "The Accord has a loophole," he said. "If the human acted without knowledge of the vampire bloodline, the debt stands. But if she knew and terminated anyway, it's considered malicious destruction of progeny. The debt is void." "Corvus will argue," Dorian told her, Lucien said quietly. He was standing by the window, his suit torn and stained with the black blood vampires apparently bled. "Can you prove he didn't?" "No," Thomas admitted. "The only witness was Dorian." Mara felt the weight of impossible logistics pressing down on her. Then she remembered something, a detail so mundane it had seemed irrelevant until now. "I have proof," she said. Everyone turned to look at her. "My medical records from the clinic. I went in for a routine pregnancy test, talked to a nurse, got blood work done. They told me it was a normal human pregnancy, standard HCG levels, standard fetal development. If there had been anything abnormal, they would have noted it." She looked at Lucien. "Those records prove I had no reason to suspect otherwise." Thomas's face lit up with something like hope. "Medical documentation, time-stamped, third-party verified. That could work." Isolde frowned. "The clinic is outside the estate. Corvus will be watching every exit. If we send someone to retrieve the records, they'll be ambushed." Lucien was quiet for a long moment. "Then I'll go myself," he said. "With Miss Chen. In public. At night. With human witnesses nearby. If Corvus attacks in front of mortals, he violates the masquerade." He looked at Thomas. "Can we present the records to the neutral council?" Thomas nodded. "If we can get them, and survive the attempt, yes." They prepared like they were going to war, which Mara supposed they were. She changed into jeans and a dark jacket, clothes that wouldn't stand out on Seattle streets. Marcus assembled a security team, 2 vampires she didn't know who would follow in a separate car. Elena gave her a small iron charm on a chain, warm in her hand when everything else in this house was cold. "Any vampire who touches you without permission will burn," Elena explained, fastening it around Mara's neck. "Use it if you must." The drive to Capitol Hill was tense and silent. Lucien sat beside her in the back of a different car, Marcus driving, the security team following at a careful distance. The city looked strange through the tinted windows, normal people living normal lives while she traveled through their world with monsters and ancient laws and debts written in blood. The clinic was closed when they arrived just after midnight, its windows dark, the parking lot empty except for a janitor's beat-up sedan. Lucien approached the night janitor with the kind of focused intensity that made Mara look away, and when she looked back, the man's eyes were glazed and he was unlocking the door with shaking hands. Compulsion, she realized. Vampires could make humans do things, believe things, forget things. They moved quickly through dark hallways that Mara had walked just 2 nights ago. She navigated to the records room, found her file in a cabinet that should have been locked but opened at Lucien's touch. Everything was there. Blood work showing normal hormone levels, ultrasound notes describing standard fetal development, no anomalies, No red flags, no indication that what she carried was anything other than human. She clutched the file to her chest as they exited into the parking lot, and that's when Corvus's people attacked. 8 of them, appearing from the shadows between cars, moving with coordinated precision. Lucien shoved Mara toward the car and told her to run, but she froze instead, watching him face 3 attackers at once while Marcus engaged 2 more and the security team scrambled to help. One vampire broke past Lucien, impossibly fast, rushing straight for Mara. She didn't scream. Some instinct from years of crisis work, of staying calm when teenagers called the hotline threatening suicide, of not panicking when situations went sideways, kicked in. She grabbed Elena's iron charm and jabbed it into the vampire's throat as he reached for her. He shrieked, a sound like metal tearing, and recoiled with smoke rising from burned flesh. Marcus shot him with a wooden bolt that punched through his chest and he crumbled to ash. Across the parking lot, Lucien was fighting with the brutal efficiency she'd seen on the surveillance feeds, but there were too many of them, and one got through his guard with a silver blade that opened his shoulder. She saw him falter, saw black blood stain his shirt, saw the attackers press their advantage, and she did something reckless. She pulled the half-healed cut on her palm open again, the one from the ritual, and threw fresh blood into the nearest attacker's face. The vampire stopped mid-strike, distracted by the scent, by the warmth of human blood still living and flowing. It gave Lucien the opening he needed. He moved like violence itself, turning the tide, and within seconds the surviving attackers were retreating into the night. Marcus got Mara into the car as police sirens wailed in the distance. Lucien slid in beside her, his shoulder still bleeding slow and black, his face pale even for a vampire. The car accelerated away from the clinic, from the ash piles and the confused janitor, and the evidence of a world humans weren't supposed to see. In the back seat, Mara's hand shook so badly she could barely hold the medical file. Lucien took her hand gently, wrapped it in a handkerchief from his pocket, his cold fingers careful around her damaged palm. "You didn't run," he said quietly. She met his eyes, saw something in them that might have been surprise or respect, or the beginning of something more complicated. "Neither did you," she said. Back at the estate, Elena examined the medical records with Thomas, while a human doctor, Lucien, apparently kept on staff stitched Mara's palm and treated Lucien's shoulder. The records were perfect, Elena announced. Time-stamped, detailed, exactly what they needed. But then her expression darkened as she looked at her phone. "We have a problem," she said. "Constantine Corvus has called for a formal Vampire Council trial in 3 days. Lucien will have to defend his claim to the debt in front of all 7 ruling houses." She looked at Lucien. "And Corvus will have his own evidence to present." The estate transformed in the 72 hours before the trial into something that felt less like a home and more like a military command center preparing for siege. Thomas commandeered the library, surrounding himself with leather-bound legal texts that predated the American Revolution and modern laptops running searches through digital archives of council precedents. Elena moved between the ritual chamber and the war room, consulting texts in languages Mara didn't recognize, building the historical case for the Bloodright Accord's applicability. Isolde drilled the security team through scenarios, her sharp voice cutting through the night air as she ran them through defensive formations and evacuation protocols. Marcus barely slept, spending his daylight hours reviewing surveillance feeds and his nights walking the perimeter with weapons Mara was learning to recognize. Wooden stakes, silver blades, iron chains that burned vampire flesh on contact. The house hummed with controlled urgency, everyone moving with purpose except Lucien. He retreated to his study on the second night and didn't emerge. Mara noticed his absence the way you notice a missing heartbeat, a gap in the rhythm that had begun to feel familiar. She found herself climbing the stairs with a cup of coffee she'd made in the industrial kitchen where human staff prepared food she rarely saw them serve, the mug warm in her hands as she navigated corridors that were becoming less foreign with each passing day. She knocked on the study door. Silence, Then his voice, distant and tired. Enter. He sat at his desk, surrounded by papers, his suit jacket discarded, his shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows in a concession to informality she'd never seen from him. The fire in the hearth burned its heatless light, and he stared into it like it might offer answers it had no capacity to provide. She set the coffee on his desk. He looked at it, then at her, something almost vulnerable in his expression. "I don't drink coffee," he said. "I know," she said, "but it's human and normal, and I thought you might want something human and normal right now." He picked up the mug, held it between his palms, let the warmth seep into skin that never generated its own heat. "Thank you," he said quietly. She sat in the chair across from him without being invited, settling into the leather with the kind of exhausted familiarity that came from 3 days of constant tension. "You're avoiding everyone," she observed. He didn't deny it. "I've never lost a council trial," he said. "In 400 years I've argued cases before the ruling houses and won every time because I was always certain of my position, always absolutely convinced of the rightness of my claim." He set the mug down carefully. "But I've never fought one where my heart was compromised." She waited, giving him space to continue. "I cared about Dorian," he said, and his voice carried weight that had nothing to do with volume. "He was my son, my heir, my hope that this existence could produce something good. And I'm beginning to care about you, Miss Chen, which makes me vulnerable in ways I haven't allowed myself to be in centuries. When you care, you make mistakes. When you make mistakes, people die." The admission hung in the air between them, honest and raw. Mara thought about the question she'd been holding since the night he appeared in the clinic corridor. "Why do you care about me?" she asked. "You didn't know me before I walked into that clinic. I was just some random human who made a choice you disagreed with." Lucien was quiet for a long moment, his eyes reflecting firelight that didn't warm. "Dorian knew you," he said finally. "He saw something worth protecting. I failed to protect him. I will not fail you." He stood and moved to the window, looking out at darkness and rain. "I was turned in 1623 during the 30 Years' War. I was a medic, or what passed for one in those days. I tried to save soldiers, stitched wounds with thread that was never clean enough, amputated limbs with saws that killed as often as they cured. The mortality rate was horrific. I watched men die from injuries I knew could be survivable if I just had better tools, more knowledge, more time." His hands curled into fists against the window frame. "A vampire found me in a field hospital after a battle. She offered me eternity in exchange for my service. Immortality," she said, "would give me all the time I needed to learn, to save lives, to make a difference. I accepted, because I thought I could help more people if I lived forever." He turned back to face her. "Instead, I learned that vampires sustain themselves on death, that immortality came with a price paid in human blood. I tried to resist at first, tried to find alternatives, but the hunger is absolute. You feed or you die, and I was too much of a coward to choose death. So I fed, and I've been feeding for 400 years." Mara watched him, this ancient thing wearing the shape of a man, and saw past the monster to the medic who'd wanted to save lives and ended up taking them instead. "You built the peace treaties," she said. "The coexistence framework. You've spent centuries trying to minimize the harm. That counts for something." "Does it?" he asked. "How many humans have I killed to reach this point? How many lives did I take while building a system that might eventually mean fewer lives are taken? The math doesn't balance, Miss Chen. It never balances." He moved back to his desk, sat heavily in his chair. "Dorian was my hope that the next generation could do better, that a vampire raised to value human life from the beginning might find a way forward I never could. And when he told me about you, about this woman who saw broken people and helped them piece themselves together, I thought perhaps there was a future where our kinds could truly coexist." not as predator and prey, but as equals. His voice dropped. Then Corvus killed him, and that future died with him. Mara stood and crossed to his side of the desk. She reached out slowly, giving him time to move away, and touched his face. His skin was cold under her palm, corpse cold, nothing alive in it. But when she touched him, he leaned into her hand like a man starving for warmth, for human contact, for something that felt real in a half-life measured in centuries. "I'm sorry I couldn't give you your grandchild," she said softly. "I'm sorry Dorian never got to tell you the truth," he replied. "You deserved that choice." The moment stretched between them, intimate and fragile, and Mara realized with sudden clarity that whatever she felt for this creature was complicated and dangerous and entirely real. Then Elena's voice cut through from the doorway. "The council has confirmed," she said. "Tomorrow night, Pioneer Square. We need to finalize our presentation." Lucien straightened, his expression shifting back to the controlled mask he showed the world. "Of course," he said. "We'll be down shortly." Elena left, and Mara pulled her hand back, the cold of his skin lingering on her palm. "Tomorrow, then," she said. "Tomorrow," he agreed. "And whatever happens, you should know that meeting you has reminded me why I fight for coexistence in the first place." She wanted to say something meaningful in return, but the words tangled in her throat. Instead, she just nodded and left him to his preparations, carrying the weight of his confession like a stone in her chest. The Masonic Temple in Pioneer Square was exactly the kind of place where ancient creatures would conduct their business, all weathered stone and esoteric symbols, sealed against human intrusion by locks that looked normal but responded to vampire touch in ways Mara couldn't quite track. They arrived after midnight, Lucien and his inner circle moving through rain-slicked streets with the careful precision of generals entering enemy territory. The 7 ruling houses were already assembled when they entered the main chamber. The space was circular, lit by torches that burned in iron sconces, the ceiling lost in shadows high above. Stone benches ringed the room in ascending tiers, creating an amphitheater effect with a clear floor in the center, where Mara understood she would stand, while they debated her fate like she was evidence rather than human. The vampires on those benches were old. She could feel it the way you feel weather changing, a pressure in the air that spoke of centuries survived and power accumulated. House Thorne held the eastern section, Lucien flanked by Isolde and Marcus and Elena. House Corvus occupied the west, and Constantine Corvus himself sat at their center like a wolf surveying a flock. He was silver-haired and lean, with the kind of charisma that made you want to listen when he spoke, and his eyes held the flat calculation of something that had long ago stopped viewing humans as anything more than resources. The other houses filled the remaining spaces. Drayton was represented by a severe woman in a high-collared dress that might have been from the 1800s. Silvano sent a man with dark skin and darker eyes who watched everything with predatory focus. Ashford's delegation wore modern business suits, their leader a sharp-faced man who looked like a corporate executive. Kurokawa's representatives sat in perfect stillness, their formal dress suggesting deep tradition. Volkov's vampires radiated cold menace, their leader a broad man with scars that suggested he'd survived things that should have killed even immortals. Each house got 1 vote. 4 votes needed to win. Lucien had historical alliances with Drayton and Kurokawa. Corvus controlled Silvano and Volkov through methods Thomas had explained involved old debts and older threats. Ashford was the swing vote, the house that would decide whether Mara lived or died, whether the Bloodright Accord stood or fell. The Keeper of Records called the session to order, an ancient vampire whose gender Mara couldn't determine and whose voice sounded like stone grinding against stone. "The matter before the council," they intoned, "is the validity of a Bloodright Accord debt claimed by House Thorne against the human Mara Chen. Let the parties present their cases." Lucien stood, and Mara was struck again by how he transformed in these moments, becoming something larger than himself. A king rather than the tired creature who'd admitted vulnerability in his study. He presented the medical records, Elena's testimony about the ritual, the legal text of the Bloodright Accord itself. He showed Dorian's journal entries proving his son had never revealed the truth to Mara, presented time-stamped evidence of her ignorance. His argument was precise and devastating. The human acted without knowledge. The law is clear. The debt stands. Constantin Corvus rose to counter, and his presence filled the chamber like smoke, insidious and choking. He argued that the accord was archaic, a relic from an era when vampires were less sophisticated in their dealings with humans. That any human who destroys vampire progeny, knowingly or not, weakens their species and should face consequences beyond mere debt service. He called for the debt to be voided and Mara released from Lucien's claim so House Corvus could claim her instead, could properly punish her for the crime of ending a bloodline. The words were reasonable, almost sympathetic, and Mara watched Ashford's leader lean forward with interest. Then Corvus revealed his trap. "I have a witness," he announced. "Someone who saw Lucien Thorne and Mara Chen together the night before his death. Someone who heard their conversation." A vampire named Celeste stepped forward from the Corvus delegation, young-looking and pretty, in a way that suggested she'd been turned in her 20s. She testified with the kind of detail that made lies believable. She'd seen them outside Mara's apartment building, heard Dorian tell Mara what he was, watched her react with horror and disgust, listened as she told him to leave and never contact her again. The next day Mara had gone to the clinic. Mara's breath stopped. It was a complete fabrication. She'd never seen Dorian after the gala night, never had that conversation, never stood outside her building with anyone. But Celeste's testimony was detailed and plausible and exactly the kind of evidence that would void the Bloodright Accord. If Mara knew and terminated anyway, she acted with malice. The debt would collapse. Ashford shifted visibly toward Corvus. Drayton looked troubled. Even Kurakawa seemed uncertain. Lucien's position was crumbling in real time. The keeper of records turned to Mara. "The human may speak in her own defense." Mara stood on shaking legs and walked to the center of the chamber. Hundreds of vampire eyes tracked her movement, ancient predators watching prey that had wandered into their territory. She denied Celeste's story, but her voice sounded thin against the stone walls, a human lie against a vampire's testimony. They would never believe her. Then she remembered. The night Celeste claimed they'd met, Mara had been at a mandatory grad school seminar on trauma-informed care. 3 hours, 6 to 9 p.m., attendance required, her advisor checking names at the door. She had proof. A sign-in sheet, photos from a classmate's Instagram showing the room, the attendees, timestamps that would match exactly when Celeste claimed she was outside her apartment. She said as much, her voice gaining strength. Thomas was already moving, laptop open, pulling digital records in real time through connections to the university's database that Mara didn't want to examine too closely. The chamber waited in tense silence as he worked, projecting the evidence onto the stone wall through a portable projector, anachronistic technology in an ancient space. The sign-in sheet appeared first, Mara's signature clear and time-stamped. Then the Instagram photos, her face visible in the background of a group shot, the timestamp reading 7:42 p.m. The exact time Celeste claimed to have seen her blocks away, having a conversation that never happened. The photos were irrefutable. Celeste had lied. The council saw it. Constantine's expression didn't change, but something cold and dangerous flashed in his eyes. Ashford's leader sat back, reassessing. The keeper of records called for a vote. Drayton voted for Lucien. Kurakawa voted for Lucien. Thorne obviously voted for itself. Corvus and its allies voted against. And Ashford, after a long pause, voted with Lucien. 4-3. "The debt stands," the keeper announced. "Mara Chen remains under the claim of House Thorne." The chamber erupted in controlled response, houses conferring quietly, strategies recalculating. Mara felt her legs go weak with relief. She'd won. They'd won. Then Constantin Corvus stood and began to applaud, slow and mocking. "Well played, Thorne," he said, his voice carrying across the chamber. "You've won the human's debt. Now you must keep her alive to collect it." He smiled, showing teeth. "And my coven is patient." The threat was clear and public and utterly within the bounds of council law. As the houses dispersed, Celeste was dragged away by Corvus's people, her face white with fear. "Punishment for failed testimony," Elena murmured. "He'll make an example of her." Mara watched the young vampire disappear into the night and realized with sick certainty that Corvus had wanted to lose. The trial was theater. He'd gotten what he really wanted, confirmation in front of all 7 houses that Mara mattered to Lucien, that she was leverage, that taking her would wound the vampire king in ways a century of war never could. Outside the temple, rain fell in sheets. Mara pulled her coat tight and felt something crinkle in the pocket. She reached in and found an envelope, plain and unmarked. She didn't remember anyone putting it there, but in the chaos of the dispersing council, anyone could have slipped it in unnoticed. She opened it. Inside was a photograph of a small house in Tacoma, the garden slightly overgrown, a wind chime hanging from the porch. Her mother's house, and a note in elegant script: "Debts are inherited. Tell the vampire king we'll take what he loves as he took from us." Mara's vision went white at the edges. Her mother lived alone in that house. Diane Chen, 62 years old, diabetic, surviving on Social Security, and the occasional check Mara sent when she had money to spare. If Corvus targeted her, if they went after a frail human woman to punish Lucien, Mara grabbed Lucien's arm, thrust the note and photo at him. "My mother," she managed. "They're going after my mother." Lucien's expression went cold and focused. "They won't touch her," he said. "I'll move her to safety tonight." He turned to Marcus, already issuing orders. "Take a team to Tacoma. Full protection detail. Bring Diane Chen back to the estate." Marcus was moving before the sentence finished, calling to Sarah and 2 other vampires. They left in a convoy of dark vehicles, racing south toward Tacoma through rain that turned the highway into a blur of lights and water. Mara rode with Lucien, her phone clutched in her hand, calling her mother's number over and over. It rang and went to voicemail, her mother's cheerful voice asking her to leave a message. "She's probably asleep," Lucien said, but his tone suggested he didn't believe it any more than Mara did. They reached the Tacoma house at 3 in the morning. The porch light was on. The front door was slightly ajar. Marcus went in first, moving fast and silent, the rest of the team spreading through the small house in a coordinated sweep. Mara followed Lucien inside and smelled it immediately. Copper and wrong. The scent of blood in a place where blood shouldn't be. The living room was undisturbed. The bedroom was empty, blankets thrown back like someone had gotten up in a hurry. And the kitchen. In the kitchen there was blood on the linoleum floor. Not a lot, but enough to show a struggle. A overturned chair, a broken mug. And on the wall above the table, painted in what Mara desperately hoped was not her mother's blood, a single word in crimson letters 2 feet high: trade. Mara stared at the word painted on her mother's kitchen wall and felt something inside her crack clean through. The blood was still wet, dripping down the faded wallpaper Diane had put up herself 15 years ago. The cheerful yellow pattern now streaked with crimson. This was her fault. She had walked into that clinic, made that choice, and somehow pulled her mother into a world of monsters and ancient debts and violence that operated by rules no human should ever have to know. Marcus moved through the house with his team, checking windows and doors, finding what Mara already knew they would find. No forced entry, he reported. She invited them in. Compulsion. 3 distinct scents, all Corvus operatives. They were in and out in under 10 minutes. Professional. She felt Lucien's presence behind her, solid and cold, and something in her snapped. She turned on him with all the rage and terror and helplessness that had been building since the moment he'd appeared in that clinic corridor. "This is your fault," she said, and her voice came out ragged and sharp. "Your war. Your world. I should never have been dragged into it. She's 62 years old. She has diabetes. She's done nothing, knows nothing. She just wanted her daughter to visit for Christmas, and now she's been taken by vampires because of a debt I didn't even know I owed." Lucien stood perfectly still, taking the verbal assault without flinching. He didn't defend himself, didn't explain about ancient laws or unavoidable consequences. He just stood there and let her rage at him because they both knew she was right. "If you can't fix this," Mara continued, her voice breaking, "if you can't get her back safe, then I don't care about your debt or your law or your 400 years of trying to build peace. None of it matters if my mother dies because I made the mistake of sleeping with your son." The words hung in the air between them, brutal and honest. Then Lucien's phone rang, the sound jarring in the blood-marked kitchen. He answered it on speaker. Constantine's voice poured out, smooth and mocking like expensive poison. "Good evening, Thorne. I trust you've received my message. The trade is simple. The human woman for your human pet. Mara Chen walks into my house unarmed and alone by midnight tomorrow. In exchange, I return Diane Chen unharmed. Refuse, and I send her back in pieces. I'll start with fingers. I understand she plays piano." Mara felt bile rise in her throat. Her mother did play piano, badly and enthusiastically, the upright in the living room covered with framed photos and sheet music for songs from musicals she loved. "No trade," Lucien said, his voice cold and absolute. "I'll mount a rescue. Release the woman and I'll consider mercy when I find you." Constantine laughed, genuinely amused. "A rescue? How noble! How predictably foolish. My estate is fortified, Thorne. Your people won't get within 100 yards before I know they're coming, and the moment I detect an assault, the woman dies." He paused. "Midnight tomorrow. Mara walks in alone, or Diane Chen's suffering becomes legendary." The line went dead. Mara was already moving toward the door. "I'll go," she said. "She's my mother. This is my decision." Lucien moved faster than she could track, blocking the doorway with his body. "You don't understand what Corvus will do to you. The debt binds you to me. If you die under his hand, it's an act of war. He's counting on that. He wants me to retaliate so the council turns on me, so the peace I've built collapses and he can seize power in the chaos. So find another way to get her out," Mara said, meeting his eyes without flinching. "But if you can't, I'm going. You don't own me, Lucien. The debt isn't slavery." Something shifted in his expression, a recalculation happening behind those ancient eyes. He stepped aside. "Then we plan," he said quietly. "And we plan well, because I will not lose both of you to Constantine's ambition." They convened back at the estate in the war room with 18 hours on the clock. Lucien, Marcus, Isolde, Elena, and Mara around the table covered in maps and building schematics and tactical assessments. Thomas joined via video call, his face pale on the screen. "The Corvus estate," Isolde said, pulling up satellite images, "is on Bainbridge Island. Modern construction, glass and steel, heavy security both vampire and human. Constantine rebuilt it 10 years ago specifically to be defensible." She traced routes on the map with one sharp fingernail. "I was allied with Corvus before I switched to House Thorne 50 years ago. I know the layout, the security protocols, the blind spots." There was history in her voice, unspoken tension that suggested her departure from Corvus's house hadn't been amicable. "Can we breach it?" Marcus asked. "Not without significant casualties," Isolde admitted. "And not before he knows we're coming. He has surveillance covering the entire island, human guards with military training, and enough vampires to hold off an assault long enough to kill the hostages. Mara listened to them discuss her mother like she was a tactical problem and forced herself to think rather than feel. She'd spent years in social work learning to compartmentalize, to function in crisis, to find solutions when emotions would only cloud judgment. She used those skills now. "What if I go in as bait?" she said. Everyone turned to look at her. "Honor the letter of Constantine's demand. I walk in unarmed and alone. But I'm wired. You track me, wait for me to locate my mother, and then breach when I signal." "It's suicide," Marcus said flatly. "The moment he detects a wire, he kills you both." "Not if the wire is good enough," Thomas said from the screen. "I have contacts who develop surveillance tech for vampire use, tech that resists the electromagnetic interference we naturally generate. An earpiece and GPS tracker, practically undetectable." Isolde frowned. "Practically isn't good enough. One security sweep and she's exposed." "What if we embed the tracker?" Elena suggested. "A molar filling, ceramic coating over the electronics. He'd have to pull her teeth to find it." The image was gruesome, but Mara nodded. "Do it." The next hours were a blur of preparation. A human dentist who apparently owed Lucien favors arrived at the estate and embedded a GPS tracker in her upper left molar, the procedure quick and professional and surreal. Elena taught her vampire compulsion resistance techniques, breathing exercises and mental focus drills that probably wouldn't stop someone as old as Constantine, but might slow him down, might give her seconds to think instead of simply obeying. Marcus produced a tiny capsule of vervain, a clear liquid in a container no bigger than a pill. "Vampire poison," he explained. "Fatal if injected directly into the bloodstream. Bite down on it and spit at close range. Last resort only. If you use it, you won't have time to get out before the whole house comes down on you." She tucked it into her cheek, learning to hold it without accidentally crushing it, practicing until it felt like a natural part of her mouth. As midnight approached, Lucien found her in the library staring at Dorian's journal without really seeing it. "Come with me," he said. He led her to a room she hadn't entered before, a bedroom that felt frozen in time, books on shelves organized by subject, sketches pinned to a corkboard, a half-finished painting of the Seattle skyline propped on an easel. Dorian's room, untouched since his death. Lucien moved to the dresser and opened a small wooden box. Inside was a silver ring, heavy and old, inscribed with symbols Mara now recognized as the Thorne family crest. "If you're walking into Corvus's house as my representative," he said, slipping the ring onto her finger, "wear this. It marks you as kin. He can harm you, but he cannot erase you." The ring was too large, meant for a man's hand, but she closed her fist and it felt solid and real. Lucien looked at her and she saw something in his expression that he was trying hard to contain. For a moment she thought he would say something important, something that would change the weight of what was about to happen. Then he stepped back. "Be smart," he said instead. "Be careful, and trust that I will come for you." She nodded, not trusting her voice. She left him standing in his dead son's room and went to say goodbye to the life she might not return to. Marcus drove her to her apartment in the early morning hours. She climbed the stairs to the place she'd lived for 2 years, unlocked the door with keys that felt foreign in her hand. Her roommates were asleep. She moved quietly through the space that had been home, grabbed a photo from her desk. Last Christmas, her and her mother in front of Diane's tree, both of them smiling, both of them safe. She tucked it into her jacket and left without looking back. The ferry to Bainbridge Island departed at 11. Mara stood on the deck as Seattle receded behind her, the city lights reflecting off black water, the rain turning everything soft and unreal. The GPS tracker in her molar felt heavy, a foreign presence she couldn't ignore. The vervain capsule sat against her cheek like a secret. At the Bainbridge terminal, a black SUV waited exactly where Constantine said it would. The driver was human, dead-eyed and silent, trained not to ask questions. They drove through the island's dark roads to an estate that looked like it had been designed by someone who wanted to prove money could buy taste, but couldn't quite manage warmth. Glass and steel and sharp angles, all modern lines and cold light pouring from floor-to-ceiling windows. The opposite of Lucien's old-world mansion. Everything about it felt deliberate and hostile. Constantine met her at the door, silver-haired and elegant in dark clothing that probably cost more than Mara's entire education. He smiled like they were old friends. "Miss Chen," he said, "welcome. Your courage is admirable." Lucien chose well. He gestured her inside. Dorian had taste. She didn't respond, just followed him through rooms that felt more like showrooms than living spaces. He walked and talked, explaining his philosophy like a professor giving a lecture to a particularly slow student. "Vampires are apex predators," he said. "We have evolved beyond human limitations. Strength, speed, immortality. And yet Lucien would have us pretend we are equals with cattle. His peace treaties are self-imposed weakness. They make us soft, make us forget what we truly are." He led her to a glass wall looking into what appeared to be a locked room. Inside, Diane Chen sat in a chair, her hands bound, her face pale but defiant. She looked up when she saw Mara, and her expression crumbled into relief and terror. Mara moved to the glass, pressed her palm against it. An intercom crackled to life. Constantine's voice. "Speak. You have 2 minutes." "Mom," Mara said, and her voice cracked. "Are you okay? Did they hurt you?" Diane shook her head. "I'm fine, sweetheart, but you need to leave. Please, whatever this is, whatever they want, it's not worth your life." "We'll both leave together," Mara promised. "I'm getting you out." She turned to Constantine. "I'm here. I came alone like you demanded. Let her go." Constantine smiled and pulled something small from his pocket. The earpiece Lucien's team had given her, crushed and broken. "Did you think I wouldn't check?" he said pleasantly. "I've been listening to your Vampire King's pathetic strike teams circle the island for the past hour. My people have them pinned offshore. They're fighting for their lives. No rescue is coming, Miss Chen. You're alone." Mara felt the floor drop out from under her. The plan had failed. Marcus and his team were trapped. She had no backup, no escape route, no leverage. And Constantine knew everything. "I don't want your life," he continued, moving closer. "I want Lucien's throne, and you're going to help me take it." He explained it like he was offering her a business deal. She would publicly renounce Lucien's claim, testify to the council that the Bloodright Accord was fabricated, that Lucien had coerced her into the debt through manipulation and threats. It would destroy Lucien's legitimacy, prove to the other houses that he was willing to break sacred law for personal gain. The council would turn on him, Constantine would challenge his kingship and win, and in exchange, Diane would go free. "Never," Mara said. Constantine sighed. He pressed a button and the door to Diane's room opened. 2 vampires entered, dragging her to her feet. Constantine produced a silver blade from somewhere, held it to Diane's throat. The metal touched her skin, and Diane whimpered, the sound small and terrified. "Choose," Constantine said, "your mother's life or your vampire king's pride." Mara's mind raced. She couldn't fight him physically. She couldn't call for help. The vervain capsule in her cheek was useless, unless she got close enough to use it, and even then it would only take out 1 vampire, leave her and her mother to face the rest. But she could outthink him. She could buy time. "I'll do it," she said. "I'll testify. But it has to be in front of the full council, all 7 houses. If it's to mean anything legally, if it's to actually destroy Lucien's legitimacy, every ruling house has to witness it." Constantine considered this. She could see him calculating, weighing the risk against the reward. He was arrogant enough to believe she wouldn't change her mind once she stood in front of the council, arrogant enough to think he'd already won. "Agreed," he said. I'll call an emergency session for tomorrow night. You'll have 24 hours to reconsider your loyalty." He gestured, and the vampires released Diane, locked her back in the room. Mara and Diane were taken to a guest suite, locked in together. The room was comfortable in the sterile way of expensive hotels, all modern furniture and neutral colors. Diane collapsed onto the bed, and Mara sat beside her, taking her mother's hands. "I'm sorry," Mara said. "I'm so sorry you got pulled into this." Diane looked at her daughter, really looked, seeing the mark on her wrist, and the silver ring on her finger, and the exhaustion that came from days of living in a world humans weren't meant to survive. "Vampires," she said. "Real vampires." Mara nodded. "Real vampires. Ancient laws. Debts written in blood." "I know it sounds insane." "It is insane," Diane agreed. "But you're here. You walked into this monster's house to save me." She touched the ring on Mara's finger. "This is his." "The Vampire King. Lucien." "Yes." Diane gave her the look only a mother can give, the one that sees through every lie and evasion straight to the truth underneath. "You love him." "No," Mara said automatically. "It's just the debt. The law. I have to help him find Dorian's killers and then I'm free." "Lying to me is one thing," Diane said gently. "Lying to yourself is another." Mara opened her mouth to deny it again and couldn't. Maybe she did love him. Maybe that's why she'd agreed to this suicidal plan, why she was willing to walk into Constantine's trap, why the thought of destroying Lucien's life's work felt worse than the thought of dying. Maybe she'd started falling the moment he'd admitted he was vulnerable, that he cared, that 400 years of existence hadn't made him immune to grief or hope, or the particular kind of loneliness that came from building a better world and watching your only heir die before seeing it completed. "I don't know," she whispered. "But I know I can't let Constantine win. I know the world Lucien is trying to build is better than the one Constantine wants. And I know I'm going to find a way to get us both out of here." She just had no idea how. At dawn, miles away at the Thorne estate, Isolde stumbled through the front door alone. Her clothes were torn and burned, silver wounds marking her arms and face, her usual composure shattered. Marcus's team had been slaughtered, ambush offshore. They'd been waiting. She collapsed in the foyer, her voice barely above a whisper. "Marcus is missing, possibly dead, and Mara is in Constantine's control, scheduled to testify before the council in 18 hours. Lucien stood frozen as Elena rushed to tend Isolde's wounds. Everything he'd built, everything he'd fought for, was about to be destroyed by his own failure to protect the people who mattered. And the human woman who'd somehow become the center of it all was walking into a trap he couldn't save her from. Lucien stood in his study, staring at a map of the Pacific Northwest, as dawn light tried and failed to penetrate the blackout curtains. For the first time in 400 years, he was considering the unthinkable. He could go to human authorities, expose vampires to the mortal world, break the masquerade that had protected his kind for centuries. If humanity knew what walked among them, if police and military and media descended on Bainbridge Island, Constantine would have to release both women or face exposure himself. It would save Mara. It would destroy everything else. Elena found him there an hour later, still staring at the map like it might rearrange itself into a solution. "You're thinking about breaking the masquerade," she said quietly. It wasn't a question. He didn't deny it. It would save her. It would doom her, Elena corrected. The council would execute every human who knew our secret to contain the breach. Mara would die along with her mother and everyone else Constantine has exposed to our world, and the peace you've built over centuries would collapse in days. She moved to stand beside him. "There has to be another way." Isolde appeared in the doorway, her wounds bandaged but still visible, her usual sharp composure returning in fragments. "There is another way," she said, "but you won't like it." They assembled what remained of Lucien's inner circle. Sarah, young and frightened but determined. Thomas via video link, exhausted but functional. Elena, with her ancient eyes that had seen empires rise and fall. And Isolde carrying secrets from her time in Corvus's house 50 years ago. Constantine has been illegally turning humans without council approval, Isolde said without preamble. Building a private army. I suspected it when I left his house but had no proof. If you can prove it at the emergency session, his credibility collapses. The council will turn on him before Mara ever has to speak. Thomas leaned forward on the screen. Article 12 violations. That's grounds for immediate sanction, dissolution of House, possible execution. But proof requires financial records, Isolde continued. Payment trails to the humans he's turned, documentation of the turnings themselves. Constantine keeps everything on a private server in his estate. I know where it is. I helped design the security. Lucien understood immediately what she was proposing. You want me to break into his house while the council session is happening, while his attention is on Mara, while most of his security force is at the temple. It's suicide, Sarah said. If he catches you, he kills you and Mara both, and claims self-defense. If we do nothing, Lucien said quietly, Mara destroys my legitimacy and Constantine wins anyway. At least this way, we're taking the fight to him. He looked at each of them in turn. I need a team. Skeleton crew. In and out before anyone knows we're there. I'll go, Sarah said immediately. I'm small, fast, good at not being seen. And I owe you. You gave me a home when I had nothing. Thomas nodded on screen. I can provide remote tech support. Guide you through the security systems, help extract the data once you're in. But you'll need someone who knows the physical layout. Isolde met Lucien's eyes. I'm coming. This is my intelligence, my risk. And I have scores to settle with Constantine that go back decades. It was decided they would move during the council session, using Constantine's divided attention as cover. Mara would stall, buying them time. And if everything went perfectly, they would emerge with evidence that would end Corvus's house before Mara had to speak a word that would destroy Lucien. If everything went perfectly. Lucien had lived 400 years. He knew nothing ever went perfectly. The council convened in the same Masonic temple as before, the circular chamber lit by torchlight that cast long shadows across stone walls. All 7 houses attended, the ruling vampires taking their positions on the tiered benches. Constantine sat in the Corvus section looking triumphant, surrounded by his inner circle. Diane Chen was brought in by 2 Corvus guards, seated in a chair near Constantine where everyone could see her, a visible reminder of what was at stake. Mara stood in the center of the chamber floor and felt the weight of hundreds of vampire eyes on her. She wore the same clothes she'd worn to walk into Constantine's house, jeans and a dark jacket, deliberately casual among all the formal dress. Dorian's ring sat heavy on her finger. The vervain capsule rested against her cheek like a promise, the keeper of records called the session to order. An emergency petition has been brought by House Corvus, they intoned. The human Mara Chen will provide testimony regarding the validity of the Bloodright Accord debt claimed by House Thorne. Constantine stood and gestured to Mara with false courtesy. Miss Chen, please, tell the council what you told me, about how Lucien Thorne manipulated you into this debt. Mara took a breath. She'd spent the night in that locked room memorizing Dorian's journal, planning this moment, knowing she had one chance to buy Lucien enough time. She began to speak, her voice calm and measured, each word carefully chosen. The Bloodright Accord is archaic, she said, a law from another era that doesn't account for modern human autonomy or reproductive rights. I was manipulated through grief and fear into accepting a debt I should never have owed. Drayton's representative leaned forward with interest. Kurokawa's delegation exchanged troubled glances. Ashford's leader nodded slowly, his expression suggesting Constantine had already been working on him behind the scenes. It was working. Mara could feel the chamber shifting toward Corvus. Lucien Thorne used his son's death as leverage, she continued. He presented the debt as my only option when in reality I was a free human being, making a medical choice that was legally and morally mine to make. She paused, let the words settle. Then she pivoted. But I've learned something about vampires in the past week. You value law above all else. Order over chaos. Precedent over convenience. She turned to face Constantine directly. So I have a question for Constantine Corvus. If the Bloodright Accord is so unjust, so archaic, why have you never formally petitioned the council to repeal it? Why resort to ambush and murder and kidnapping instead of legal reform? Constantine's smile didn't waver, but something cold flashed in his eyes. The accord is a symptom of weak leadership, not the disease itself. Changing one law while Thorne remains king accomplishes nothing. Mara pulled a folded piece of paper from her pocket, a transcript she'd made from memory of Dorian's journal. She'd been counting on Constantine not searching her thoroughly after taking the obvious wire, counting on arrogance and overconfidence making him careless. She held it up for the council to see. This is a journal entry written by Dorian Thorne 2 days before his death, she said. She began to recite, her voice carrying across the stone chamber. Father warned me Constantine's house still practices the old hunts, unsanctioned killings of humans for sport, in violation of the masquerade and council law. He's building a case to bring before the council. If he succeeds, Corvus will be sanctioned. She lowered the paper and met Constantine's gaze. Dorian wasn't killed for being Lucien's son. He was killed for knowing too much about your crimes, for being a threat to your house's ability to operate outside council authority. Constantine's composure cracked. He surged to his feet with inhuman speed, moving toward Mara with violence written in every line of his body. Guards from House Ashford intercepted him before he reached her, silver chains appearing from nowhere to bind his arms. Attacking the accused during a council session is grounds for immediate sanction, Ashford's leader said coldly. Stand down, Corvus. Mara turned to address the full council, her heart hammering but her voice steady. I don't renounce Lucien's claim. I renounce Constantine's right to question it. This was never about the Bloodright Accord. It was about silencing a threat to his illegal activities. It was about starting a war that would let him seize power. She gestured to Diane, still held by Corvus guards. He kidnapped my mother to force my testimony. That's not legal reform. That's terrorism. The chamber erupted in controlled chaos, houses conferring, accusations flying. And miles away on Bainbridge Island, Lucien was breaking into Constantine's estate. The house was nearly empty, most of Corvus's forces deployed to the council session or stationed as perimeter guards outside. Lucien moved through shadows with Sarah and Isolde flanking him, following the route Isolde had memorized decades ago. Thomas's voice came through their earpieces, guiding them past security systems and camera blind spots. The server room was in the basement, behind a locked door that Isolde opened with codes she shouldn't still remember but did. Inside, banks of computer equipment hummed in climate-controlled air. Thomas talked them through the access process, his fingers flying over a remote connection. Files began downloading, financial records showing payments to 47 newly turned vampires over the past decade, GPS coordinates for old hunt sites, video footage that made even Lucien, who had seen centuries of violence, look away in disgust. Humans hunted and killed for entertainment, their deaths recorded and archived like trophies. And then Lucien found the dossier on Dorian, surveillance photos spanning months, intercepted messages between father and son, and a final entry dated the day before Dorian's death. Target acquired. Termination authorized by KC. Reason: potential whistleblower. Article 12 violations. Constantine hadn't killed Dorian to start a war. He'd killed him to prevent exposure of illegal vampire creation, the very crime the council had been established to prevent. Everything Mara had just told the council was true. Lucien was downloading the files to a secure drive when Celeste appeared in the doorway. The young vampire who'd lied at the first trial, who'd been left behind as minimal security, while Constantine's main force attended the council. She saw Lucien and her eyes went wide. Then she sounded the alarm, a high-pitched shriek that would bring every Corvus vampire within a mile running. Sarah and Thomas fled with the drive, while Lucien stayed to hold her off, buying them time to escape. Celeste was fast and vicious, trained in combat techniques that hadn't existed when Lucien was human. She came at him with silver blades and inhuman speed, forcing him back. He could kill her. It would be easy, justified even as self-defense, but killing her would make him the aggressor, would give Constantine ammunition to claim Lucien had attacked his house unprovoked. Instead, Lucien fought defensively, disarming her without delivering fatal blows, pinning her against the wall with his forearm across her throat. He could feel Corvus vampires approaching, had seconds to make this work. "Testify against Constantine," he said quickly. "Tell the council what you know about the illegal turnings, the old hunts, everything. I'll give you asylum in House Thorne, protection from retaliation, a chance to be free of him." Celeste's eyes were wild with fear, and something else, something that might have been hope. "He beats us," she whispered. "The lower-ranked vampires in his house. He says it keeps us obedient. I've wanted to leave for years, but there's nowhere to go. He'd hunt me down." "Not if the council sanctions him first," Lucien said. "Not if you help me end his house tonight." She made her decision in the space of a heartbeat. She nodded. Lucien released her and they ran, escaping through a service exit as Corvus's security forces stormed the basement, finding nothing but empty server room and missing files. Back at the council chamber, Constantine was still restrained and furious when Lucien strode through the main entrance. He was bloodied from the fight with Celeste, his suit torn, but he carried himself like a king returning from victory. He held up the secure drive for the entire council to see. "I have evidence," he announced, "of Article 12 violations on a scale unprecedented in modern vampire history." Thomas appeared on a projection screen Elena had somehow arranged, and he began displaying the files, financial records, names and dates of illegal turnings, video footage of old hunts that made even the eldest vampires look away in disgust. And the dossier on Dorian, proof that Constantine had ordered his death not as an act of war, but as assassination to prevent exposure. The chamber watched in absolute silence. When the presentation ended, Ashford's leader stood. "This council calls for an immediate vote on the status of House Corvus. All in favor of stripping Constantine Corvus of his seat, dissolving his house, and redistributing his vampires among the remaining houses, or sanctioning them as appropriate." 6 hands rose. Only Corvus abstained. "The vote is carried," Ashford declared. "House Corvus is ended. Constantine Corvus is stripped of all authority and protection under council law." Constantine moved before anyone could stop him, breaking the silver chains through sheer furious strength. He grabbed Diane Chen from her chair, produced a wooden stake from somewhere, held it to her heart. "You think you've won, Thorne," he snarled. "I'll take everything from you, starting with this." Mara didn't freeze. She'd learned from watching Lucien fight, from surviving a week in a world that operated by violence as much as law. She grabbed the silver candelabra from the ceremonial altar 3 feet away and swung it at Constantine's head with all the strength she had. It connected with a wet crack. Silver burned vampire flesh on contact, and Constantine shrieked, dropping Diane, his hands going to his face where the metal had seared through skin. Lucien moved faster than Mara could track, a blur of motion that ended with the ceremonial wooden staff from the keeper's podium driven through Constantine's heart. The ancient vampire looked down at the stake in his chest, then up at Lucien with something that might have been surprise. Then he crumbled to ash, 400 years of existence, ending in seconds. The chamber was absolutely silent. Lucien had just killed a rival house leader in front of all 7 ruling houses. It was technically legal, self-defense of a human under his claim. But it was also a seismic act that would reshape vampire politics for decades to come. Ashford stepped forward, his expression unreadable. He looked at the ash pile that had been Constantine Corvus, then at Lucien, standing bloodied and triumphant, then at Mara holding a silver candelabra like a weapon. "The Corvus line is ended," he said formally. "Long live House Thorne." One by one, the other houses repeated the phrase, a ritual acknowledgement of Lucien's victory and authority. The session was over. Diane was freed, shaking and pale, but alive. Mara dropped the candelabra and her legs gave out, adrenaline finally crashing after a week of constant crisis. Lucien caught her before she hit the floor, his arms cold and solid and utterly safe. He held her like she was the only real thing in a world of shadows and ash, like if he let go, she might disappear. "I've got you," he said quietly. "You're safe." And for the first time since walking into that clinic a week ago, Mara believed him. 1 week after the council session that ended with Constantine Corvus crumbling to ash, Mara sat in the Thorne Estate Library trying to read a book on vampire legal history, and mostly just staring at the words without comprehending them. Her body had healed from the physical toll of the past weeks, but her mind kept circling back to that moment in the chamber when she'd swung the silver candelabra, when Lucien had driven the stake home, when 400 years of existence had ended in seconds because they'd fought back. Diane was staying in a guest suite down the hall, under protection until Lucien's security team confirmed no remaining Corvus loyalists were planning retaliation. Her mother had adapted to the reality of vampires with the same practical resilience she'd used to survive their father leaving, to raise Mara alone, to build a life from nothing. She asked questions, learned the rules, and treated the vampire staff with the same courtesy she'd show anyone. Mara heard voices from the next room and recognized her mother's tone, the one that meant she was about to say something important, whether you wanted to hear it or not. She moved closer to the doorway and saw Diane had cornered Lucien near the floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. "You're in love with my daughter," Diane said. It wasn't a question. Lucien stood very still, his usual composure intact, but something vulnerable in his eyes. He didn't deny it. Diane studied him with the piercing assessment only a mother could manage, seeing past the expensive suit and inhuman stillness to whatever truth lay underneath. "She deserves a man who sees daylight," Diane said finally. "Someone who can grow old with her, give her normal things like Sunday brunch and retirement plans. But if you're what she chooses, then don't you dare waste her time pretending you're a monster. You've spent 400 years trying to be better than what you are. That counts for something." Lucien inclined his head slightly, the gesture oddly formal. "I will not waste her time," he said quietly. "I promise you that." Diane nodded, satisfied, and left him standing among the books, looking like a man who'd just been given permission he hadn't known he needed. 2 days later, Marcus returned. He'd survived the offshore ambush, but barely, pulled from the water by a fishing boat after lying wounded on the rocks for hours, while his vampire healing slowly knitted together silver burns and broken bones. He was still pale and moving carefully when he found Mara in the conservatory where she'd been helping Elena catalog medicinal plants. They stood in awkward silence for a moment. Then Marcus said, "You didn't give up. When Corvus had you, when the plan fell apart, you kept fighting. You bought us the time we needed. Thank you." Mara shook her head. "You came for my mother. You were willing to die to get her back. We're even." Marcus almost smiled, a rare expression on his scarred face. "In this world, Miss Chen, debts are never quite even, but I'm glad to owe you this one." On the 10th day, Elena performed the ritual to dissolve the Bloodright Accord debt. The same circular chamber, the same silver basin, but this time the words were different, releasing rather than binding. Mara felt the mark on her wrist grow warm, and then fade completely, the thin red line disappearing as if it had never existed. She was free. Free to leave the estate, free to return to her normal life, free from the law that had bound her to Lucien's house. Elena watched her with ancient knowing eyes. "What will you do now, child?" Mara looked at her unmarked wrist, at the ring she still wore on her finger, at the room where she'd been claimed and now released. "I have unfinished business," she said. She found Lucien in Dorian's room 3 hours later. He was standing by the window holding the half-finished painting of the Seattle skyline, lost in thought or memory or grief that didn't fade just because the person who'd caused it had been avenged. She knocked, softly on the open door. He turned, saw her, and something complicated crossed his face. "You're avoiding me," she said. He set the painting down carefully. "I'm giving you space. The debt is dissolved. You're free to go." "That didn't answer my question," Mara said, stepping into the room. "Why are you avoiding me?" He was quiet for a long moment. "Because if I see you, I'll ask you to stay. And you've been bound to this house by law and violence long enough. You deserve freedom, not another cage built from my needs." "What if I don't want freedom from you?" Mara said. "What if I want to choose you without a debt forcing me? What if I've already chosen, and I'm just waiting for you to stop being noble about it?" Lucien looked at her like she was something rare and breakable. "You don't know what you're choosing. I'm 400 years old. I've killed more people than I can count. I'll never age, never change, never give you the normal life your mother wants for you." "I know exactly what I'm choosing," Mara said, closing the distance between them. "I'm choosing someone who spent centuries trying to build a better world. Someone who loved his son enough to grieve him. Someone who looks at me and sees a person, not prey." She touched his face, cold skin under her palm. "I'm choosing you, Lucien. If you'll have me." He resisted for half a second, some last shred of nobility or self-denial trying to hold. Then he gave in and kissed her like a man who'd been alone for centuries finally finding warmth. It was desperate and tender, careful and consuming. 400 years of loneliness crashing into one human's warmth and finding something that felt remarkably like home. When they finally pulled apart, Mara said, "I need to finish my degree. I need to live my life, do my work, be human. But I'll come back to the estate when I choose. Not because I'm bound, because I want to." Lucien nodded slowly. "I'll wait. I'm very good at waiting." 3 months later, Mara sat in her apartment with her laptop open, finishing the final edits on her thesis. Trauma and Resilience in Marginalized Communities. She'd used a pseudonym for one of her case studies, a community navigating coexistence with a dominant culture that didn't understand them, that feared them, that had spent centuries trying to either destroy or assimilate them. Her advisor had called it fascinating theoretical work. Mara knew it was just careful observation of the vampire world she'd been pulled into. Diane was doing better. The knowledge that vampires were real had somehow made her less anxious rather than more, as if knowing the truth, however strange, was better than the vague fears and uncertainties that had plagued her for years. They had dinner once a week, and Diane insisted Lucien join them. He was awkward with human food and small talk, clearly uncomfortable in the bright fluorescent lighting of the diner Diane preferred. But he tried. He asked about Diane's piano playing, and listened to her talk about her garden, and made an effort to be part of Mara's normal life, even though nothing about him was normal. The formal letter arrived on a cold December evening, delivered by Sarah, who grinned and said Lucien had been planning this for weeks. "House Thorne requests the honor of your presence at the Winter Solstice Gala," it read in elegant script. "You are invited as honored guest, not as debtor." The distinction felt important. Mara called Elena, who admitted she'd already picked out a dress, deep blue silk that would fit perfectly. "You're meddling," Mara said, but she was smiling. "Always," Elena agreed cheerfully. "It's one of the privileges of age." The night of the gala, Mara arrived at the estate to find it transformed. Ice sculptures glittered in the gardens, their surfaces catching candlelight and throwing prismatic reflections across the snow. The interior was warm despite the December cold, every room glowing with candles and gaslight, and the soft golden illumination Lucien preferred. Vampires and humans mingled in the ballroom, the careful coexistence Lucien had been building for decades made visible and real. She recognized some of the human guests, politicians and activists and community leaders who'd been read into the secret, who were helping navigate the complicated intersection of vampire and human law. Lucien's vision slowly becoming reality. Lucien found her near the refreshment table where she was talking to Thomas about council legal reforms. He wore a tailored black suit that made him look less like a king and more like a man. His usual formal distance softened into something more approachable. "May I have this dance?" he asked. She took his hand and let him lead her onto the floor. They swayed to music played by a string quartet, vampires and humans dancing around them, the world Lucien had fought for on display in this one perfect moment. He told her about a new project, a council initiative to modernize vampire-human relations laws, to create formal frameworks for the kind of coexistence that had been mostly informal until now. "I want your input," he said. "Your social work expertise is invaluable for understanding how to build systems that protect both our peoples." "I'll help," Mara said, "but on one condition." "Name it," he said, curiosity in his expression. "You stop treating me like I'll break," she said. "I've walked into a vampire king's house unarmed, outmaneuvered a council session, and hit a 300-year-old vampire with a candelabra. I'm tougher than I look." Lucien smiled. The first real unguarded smile she'd seen from him, something warm and genuine that transformed his usually remote features into something almost human. "Noted, Miss Chen," he said. As the dance ended, Elena appeared at the edge of the ballroom, her expression troubled. She caught Lucien's eye and gestured subtly toward a side corridor. He excused himself with apologies and followed her to a small study away from the party noise. Mara watched them go, saw the way Lucien's posture shifted from relaxed to alert, and felt the first whisper of unease. She followed at a distance, close enough to hear Elena's quiet voice. "I've received a message from the European Council," Elena said. "There are rumors of a new faction rising. Vampires who believe the Corvus philosophy should have won, that vampire supremacy is natural law and coexistence is weakness." Lucien's expression went cold. "Who leads them?" "A name I haven't heard in a century," Elena said. "Lysander. He was exiled after the last great vampire war for crimes that made even the council flinch, atrocities committed in the name of proving vampire superiority." Lucien closed his eyes briefly. "I thought he was dead." "So did everyone," Elena said. "But he surfaced again. And he knows about Mara. He knows she's the human who ended the Corvus line, who stood before the council and won. He's declared her a symbol, proof that humans can destroy vampires, that coexistence is a fantasy that will only lead to our extinction." "He'll come for her," Lucien said quietly. "Not just her," Elena warned. "He'll come for the idea she represents, that vampires can love humans without consuming them, that we can build a world where both our peoples thrive. He'll try to destroy that idea by destroying her." Lucien was silent, his mind clearly racing through strategies and contingencies. He could hide Mara, lock her away in the estate under constant guard, make her a prisoner for her own protection, or he could trust her to stand beside him in whatever war was coming, let her be the partner she'd proven herself to be. Across the ballroom, Mara laughed at something Sarah had said, her face bright and alive in the candlelight. She glanced over, caught Lucien's eye through the doorway, and nodded. A silent promise. "I'm not going anywhere." Lucien felt something settle in his chest, a decision made. Neither was he. They would face this new threat together, human and vampire, building the future Dorian had believed in even as enemies gathered to tear it down. The gala continued, music and laughter, and the fragile, beautiful vision of coexistence on display. But as the night deepened and guests began to depart, a figure watched from the tree line beyond the estate gates. Ancient and patient, with eyes that had seen empires fall and oceans of blood spilled in the name of vampire supremacy. Lysander stood in the shadows and smiled. Let the vampire king have his human, he thought. Let him believe love could bridge the gap between predator and prey. When I take her from him, when I prove that humans are nothing but cattle dressed in sentiment, the world will remember why they should fear the night. The figure turned and disappeared into darkness, leaving only footprints in the snow that faded as the wind rose. Inside the estate, Lucien held Mara close as the last dance ended, unaware of the eyes that had watched them, the threat that was gathering across an ocean. For tonight, they had won. They had survived. They had built something worth protecting. Tomorrow would bring its own battles. But tonight, in this moment, they had each other. And sometimes that was enough. The ballroom lights dimmed, the music faded, and in the quiet aftermath of celebration, a new story began to write itself in blood and shadow, and the stubborn human belief that love could survive even the longest night.